From this haunt of robbers, we went to Hortense. One of us had letters of introduction to a member of the Legislative Assembly who had not been distinguished in the convention and was afraid of showing himself at his usual abode. His family consisted of a respectable and clever wife and 3 charming daughters. Our stay with them might have endangered them. We therefore continued our journey. There, as well as everywhere else, terror was carried to a great height. Not emotion, not an attempt had been made to counteract the enterprises of the factious. People remained silent or left the place for fear of exposing themselves. The most honest were denounced. The lower classes made everybody tremble with their clamor and became everywhere masters through the misunderstanding and want of courage of those who, having property to save, did not blush to fall back before those who had nothing to lose. We arrived at last on the 12th of September at Villefranche, near Lyon, where the Legion of Montesquieu was in garrison. Monsieur Dillier had shown us a pattern of the regimentals and had boasted to us of the discipline and good appearance of the regiment. We were to be received in the most flattering manner by the officers, all of them well-bred young men, and who would undoubtedly live as brothers with us. We formed to ourselves most delightful ideas of our new manner of living. As we got nearer to Villefranche, our excited imagination made us hasten our pace. We came to the side of a very extensive field, at the other end of which we saw some troops maneuvering. My companions, either through some illusion or indistinctness of vision, fell into rapture at the wonderful good order of the troops. In fact, their muskets glittered in the rays of the sun, and their lines seemed to present admirable regularity. As for me, I saw nothing but strange dresses, or rather the rags of misery, and the reader may judge our consternation when, on approaching, we found 400 or 500 wretches in tattered garments, and none but the officers dressed in the elegant regimentals we had so much admired. We were going away, and should perhaps have taken the dangerous resolution of deserting, when an officer came up to us and asked us, in a strong German accent, whether we had not the honor to belong to the corps. Without waiting for the answer of my companions, I showed my feuille de route, my map. They were all obliged to do the same, and as soon as the maneuvers were finished, the officer placed us in the rear of the troop, and we entered the city marching like experienced soldiers, but ashamed of being seen in such bad company by the fair ladies of Villefranche, who looked at us as we passed, and did not seem greatly to admire our appearance. This still incomplete legion, whose existence, by the by, was neither long nor brilliant, consisted of the remainder of the regiment of the Royal Liégeois that had been disbanded for some wild freaks, and of young men who had enlisted for 10 crowns each. They were all of them adverse to discipline and wished to fight for diversion. But the major, Monsieur Ross, was a grave man. I have never since met with a person who carried to so great a degree as he did his enthusiasm for the military catechism and for all the minutiae of the service. He knew just French enough to command his troop, which consisted almost wholly of Flemings and Alsatians. After 25 years' service, he had attained the rank of major, but still Monsieur Ross was not satisfied. Since he could no longer maintain discipline by flogging, he complained that command fatigued him. I had become his friend because he had found me exact, attentive, and serious at my exercise. My friend, he used to say to me, war is always fatal to an army. There is no more discipline, no more order, no more subordination. Woe to the regiment that leaves its garrison for the field of battle. Oh, if you had seen the camp at Verberie or Saint-Omer, what a beautiful sight it was. The tents all in straight lines, the troops under arms at 4 o'clock in the morning, their dresses clean, admirable maneuvers. And in the evening, at the calling over, nobody missing, everybody ready. Now I have to command nothing but tattered wretches. What am I to do with these men, whom it is impossible to keep in order? This will be war indeed. things will go as bad as they can, but I am resolved to retire from the service. Poor man, he did, in fact, retire the following year. I hope he lived long enough both to wonder and rejoice at our victories. I suffered a great deal in the beginning. I had lived in affluence in Paris, in the midst of my family, by whom I was beloved, and in the society of agreeable friends. Now I was forced to live with soldiers. The sergeants vouchsafed to protect me, but the officers never cast a look on me. I began to feel some disgust, but luckily, before it was too late, I made deep reflections on my situation, and I conceived it myself, that it might be possible to raise myself out of it by giving myself up entirely to the duties I had to fulfill. Till then, I had passed my time in coffee houses or in reading novels. I left off that idle life. I studied the military law, and I rigidly obeyed it in all its details, so that within 6 weeks I was made a corporal. My situation was growing better. I still obeyed everybody, but I commanded a few. Monsieur Illier arrived. Our troop was soon completely equipped, and as that officer had served in the regiment of Alsace, he was subjected us to such severe and rigid discipline that in less than 2 months our legions could vie with the finest corps of the Northern Army. The duties prescribed for each moment, instead of discouraging me, made me fond of them. The maneuvers of a battalion gave me desire to learn the elements of the art of war, and I read with eagerness several new works that had lately appeared, such as La Guerre de Poste by Cossack, Les Fortifications de Campagne by de Belair, and others. My colonel, who had taken a liking to me, gave me lessons in strategy and castrametation and taught me to understand military maps. I was soon raised to the rank of sergeant, and my hopes knew no more bounds when, all in a sudden, General Custines summoned Colonel Delier to the Rhine army, instead of General Houchard, his first aide-de-camp, who had been appointed to the command of the Moselle army. The departure of Monsieur Illier was a thunderstroke for me, but he promised to transfer my companions and myself to the Rhine army, and he kept his word. A short time after his arrival at Mentz, we received commissions of second lieutenants in the 93rd Regiment of the Infantry of the Line. I was at Berg. I received the order to go to the Rhine, and just then arrived the news of the sentence and death of the king. Although the Jacobins were masters of the town and added by their vociferations consternation to the terror their threats and conduct had already inspired, still the fatal account caused a deep impression on the minds of the public. To form a just idea of that terrible sentence, we must consult a pamphlet published by Monsieur de Chateaubriand in the beginning of 1815, wherein he explains with great sagacity the secret motive that induced so many deputies to vote for the death of Louis XVI. The municipality of Paris ruled with all the energy of savage and desperate tyranny. That body insisted at any rate on the death of the king and threatened openly to murder the whole royal family, who were then in their sole power. Many deputies imagined that the only way to save the heir of the throne and his family was to offer up the unfortunate king as a victim to popular fury. They were mistaken, but still deserving of pardon. On the other hand, if it be true that Louis XVI signed the Treaty of Pillnitz, that he persuaded the privileged classes to leave France and enlist under foreign banners, that he had agreed with his brothers and their party that they should try to deliver him by means of a war that was to expose his country to all the horrors of invasion, though he had sworn to maintain and execute the Constitution. If all this be true, I do not hesitate to say that he was guilty. He could reign no longer, but the convention had no right to try him, and by putting him to death they committed a most impolitic fault. Did they not see that by taking the life of Louis XVI, they gave the crown to Louis XVIII? That they ought to have kept the king prisoner, lest they should place a king in the hands of the enemy? That the life of a monarch so celebrated for weakness or for false and contracted ideas ought to have been carefully protected, as he would soon or late be succeeded by his brother, the qualities of whose mind were so superior to those of the king, and whose character already known would have so deplorable an influence over the destiny of France. But the convention was pressed by passing events inflamed by resentment and by the contest of the 10th of August. It consisted in a great part of men without experience, who, seized with a fatal mania for celebrity, wished to impress the minds of the people with a sort of horror mixed with admiration by a great act of injustice, which they called an act of national justice. They succeeded, but the revenge of Europe fell heavily on France, and France, mighty through the fury of her government, subdued the armies of Europe. None but young men can well feel the happiness of wearing an epaulette, and particularly those who rise from the ranks. It is a feeling of vanity, I own, but that vanity makes heroes. I was not destined to be one, but it is not my fault, for I never felt a greater degree of incitement. During the journey, I constantly reflected on the duties I should have to fulfill. My heart beat at the thoughts of my country. I was proud at the idea of shedding my blood for her. War then raged in all its force. At every place where we stopped to rest, I read the newspapers, I questioned my landlords, and whenever I learned that the Rhine army had fought, I burned with impatience. It seemed to me as if I ran the risk of arriving too late. All the ideas that had tormented me in Paris were forgotten. The happiness of fighting for my country had absorbed them all. If I speak of these deep impressions that every Frenchman shared, it is because at present they are considered as criminal. In the Holy Week of the year 1793, I arrived at Worms, where the 2nd Battalion of my regiment was in garrison. I went to see my colonel, Monsieur de Loriol. He was an old man who bore in his countenance all the austerity of a former major, and all his vexation at being obliged to command plebeian officers. He received me very ill, assigned me a company, and sent me away. I then went to my new captain. If the colonel's reception was haughty, that of the captain was impertinent. I had served as sergeant in the King's regiment, the non-commissioned officers of which I used to learn a little mathematics to distinguish them from their comrades of other corps. This poor man consequently looked upon himself as an officer of old standing. He spoke ill of his comrades and superiors, said a number of absurdities about war which he did not understand, and would perhaps have succeeded in making me very unhappy in my situation if I had not found a protector in Monsieur de la Poterie, my lieutenant colonel. This respectable gentleman invited me to come and see him frequently and promised to advance me if I behaved well. He was killed a short time after at the head of his battalion. His memory has always been dear to me, and I shall never forget the kindness he showed me. The success of our armies began, however, to diminish. Our conquests had been rapid, but we were in danger of losing them again. Dumouriez, after having deceived both the court and the Jacobins, wanted to draw the king out of the abyss and crush his enemies. His presumption led him to hope that he should be luckier than Monsieur Lafayette. But the army took no interest in the king, being bound by no tie to his person, and though the troops had no affection for a provisional government scarcely established, they still remained nobly faithful to their high duty of defending the territory and ensuring the independence of the country. Dumouriez lost Belgium and was obliged to seek refuge in foreign countries after having committed 2 disgraceful acts, namely, treating with the enemy of his country and delivering over the commissioners of the convention, among whom was one of his old comrades, General Bournonville. The army of the Rhine was also attacked by the enemy with renewed force. Frankfort was evacuated, and we retired at Metz, and from thence farther back. General Custines left there as commander-in-chief, General Douaret as commander of the engineers, Colonel Miguier as commander of the fortified camp, Major General Kleber and as commander of the fortress, Monsieur Albert Dubaillet. General Blau was ordered to leave the town at the head of a body of some 1,000 men, and the garrison of Worms was to cover his retreat. The command of 4 battalions of that garrison was given to a young officer of the staff. This was to say, who subsequently distinguished himself by so many noble feats and by his heroic character. General Blau, embarrassed in his retreat by an enormous quantity of equipage belonging to persons unconnected with the army that had been sent out of the town, was unable to resist the imposing force of the enemy and was obliged to re-enter the city. He and his troops contributed largely to the loss the enemy suffered during the siege. General Custine might have taken a fine position behind the Queich, but he preferred retiring behind the lines of the Lutter, resting on the mountains of the Vosges and on the Rhine at Lauterburg. The intention of the general in choosing a position so far from Mentz, a place that could not long be left to itself, was undoubtedly to take leisure to instruct and discipline a young and inexperienced army. But he was blamed by many generals, and particularly by Coquebert, one of his aides-de-camp, an officer of distinguished merit and much esteemed by his commander, not only for his extended information in different branches of military science, but also for a frankness of character which was perhaps not devoid of some asperity. 2 days after the arrival of the headquarters at Weissenberg, Coquebert came to the general, and after having again brought to his mind the weighty reasons that ought to have led him to prefer the position of the Queich, he said somewhat harshly that evil reports had been the result of his contrary resolution, and that even the word treason had been pronounced. Custine immediately seized his pistols and, throwing them on the table, cried, "If I am a traitor, blow my brains out." Coquebert, struck with the noble indignation of a man so unjustly aspersed, was himself confounded, and the only answer he gave his general was to discharge one of the pistols off in his own face. He fell. His jawbone was broken, but he did not die from his wound. At the trial of General Custine, Coquebert was called as witness in the hope that he would renew his charge, but he behaved like an honorable man, completely justifying his general and accusing himself of a fit of madness. He was subsequently taken prisoner at the Battle of Hontshoot. I saw him afterwards in Paris, but probably the sufferings he experienced during his captivity deranged his intellects, for he completely lost his senses and died in a madhouse, notwithstanding the pains that were taken for several years to cure him. The departure of General Houchard left the post of chief of the general staff to the army vacant. Custine bestowed on it Colonel Dillier, who was made a major general and who chose me for his aide-de-camp. I occupied that post with a great deal of pleasure because it was an advancement and procured me means of instruction. The army was at that time not above 40,000 strong. The generals were well chosen. Most of them belonged to that part of the nobility which had given proofs of fidelity to their country in defending it against foreigners, but for which they were cruelly punished. Distrust of the nobility was growing stronger every day in the new government. Near the armies were placed commissioners of the convention who shared the same sentiments. The extent of power with which they were invested prompted them to misuse it. The general-in-chief was forced to communicate and discuss with them not only his plans, but even the particulars of the service. They were the fountains of favor, and their influence soon became dangerous and fatal to the respect due to the general-chief. Several commanders bore impatiently the contumely with which these proconsuls affected to treat things, and they frequently uttered offensive railleries against their persons. The violent temper of General Custine made him repel with anger contradictions that were rendered unbearable by a total absence of propriety and military knowledge. His situation grew more difficult from day to day. It became, however, necessary to act. The communication with Landau had ceased to be militarily established. The siege of Metz was urged with vigor. Custine was at this time made commander-in-chief of the Northern Army. in the place of General Dampierre, who had been killed. He would not, however, leave the army of the Rhine without having drawn it out of the unfortunate position in which it then was. He attacked the enemy along his whole line, but without success. It was reported that his intention was to get his army beaten by the corps of emigrants. An absurd calumny. We scarcely saw that body on the 17th of May. The fact is that the general who commanded the right of the army at Lauterburg did not obey the orders he'd received or executed them ill. The enemy, who, according to the plan of the general-in-chief, was to have had his left wing turned, not being attacked on that side, found himself in full force before the center of the army commanded by Custines. A charge of cavalry was repulsed by a masked battery of 2 field pieces, and in their flight the cavalry hurried along with them some battalions. I only mention this battle because it became one of the charges against the unfortunate Custines. He left us on the following day for the Northern Army, where the same prejudice of calumny awaited him. He was soon after deprived of his command and summoned to Paris, where he died on the scaffold. His condemnation was one of the first crimes of the sanguinary tribunal, which afterwards committed so many. Custines was a lover of liberty, and never did a thought of treason enter his mind. The consolation of religion soothed his last moments. And such was the fanaticism of his time that a man who had always shown himself full of intrepidity under the greatest trials was accused of cowardice because he walked to the scaffold accompanied by a clergyman.